Thank you. Thank you, Tamisha. So today, Metro and I will be talking about argument apposition in Pangasinan. Sorry, give me a minute. Yes. So argument apposition is something described in Benton 1971's Grammar of the Language as a phenomenon whereby an argument might be pronominalized and followed by an appositive phrase marked as topic. This appositive phrase identifies the entity represented by the pronoun. In one here, we have insulat to sulat liham, and in this case, there is no apposition, and hence the third person genitive clitic pronoun that follows the verb act as the non-pivot agent. One thus means something like he or she wrote the letter. When there's apposition, however, we see an additional demonstrative mark phrase in the clause. This demonstrative mark phrase means the man, and this sentence now means the man wrote the letter. Literally, we can interpret this as he wrote the letter, the man. In this talk, we'll argue that apposition is best analyzed as involving a clause medial hanging topic, which then gets linearized post-verbally. All uncredited data comes from original fieldwork with native speakers of Pangasinan. Here's an overview of what we'll be doing today. I'll first be talking about some basic characteristics of argument apposition. Mitchell will then go through two possible analyses and a proposal before concluding our presentation. Yeah, so first let's go through some basic characteristics. Pangasinan exhibits a familiar Philippine type voice system. So the argument, which we call the pivot, has its choice cross-referenced by verbal morphology, and the pivot is marked nominative. Other arguments receive genitive or oblique case. In 2A, we have an actor voice clause, and here the agent is selected to be the pivot, which receives su, the nominative case marker. The non-pivot team receives la, which is a genitive case marker. Likewise, in 2B, we have a patient voice clause, and the team is selected to be the pivot, which is nominative mark, while the agent is the non-pivot, which is genitive mark. Post-verbal word order in the language is subject to scrambling, and thus is generally free. Sorry, it's a bit slow. Oh no. Okay, sorry. So in Benton 1971, he describes apposition as the process where there's a pronoun and a corresponding topic NP. The topic NP identifies the entity represented by the pronoun. We call this NP the associate. And note here when we talk about apposition that we are following Benton's terminology. And this use of apposition should not be confused with the other uses, such as nominal appositives. For example, when we say something like the linguist Benton, when we have two NPs which refer to the same entity occurring side by side. It should also not be confused with appositive relative clauses. Associates in Pangasinan don't bear regular case markers such as su or la. Instead, they are headed by demonstrative articles. So on the screen here, we see a full list of the demonstratives. We have an unmarked my series, a proximate yai series, and a distal tai series. All of these can be used to mark associates in Pangasinan. Now let's look at a few examples of argument apposition. Firstly, argument apposition is the most productive and frequent in non-actor voices, and apposition takes place of the agent argument. As mentioned previously, in non-actor voices, agents are in genitive case. So in 3 here, we have a baseline PV clause, and the man, which is the genitive argument, is marked with the case marker la. When we have non-pivot agent apposition, when we have non-pivot agent apposition, instead of the genitive case marker, we see that a demonstrative appears in front of the non-pivot agent. So this demonstrative can be my, yai, or tai. And in addition, we see an additional clitic pronoun appearing directly after the verb, which co-indexes the associate phrase. Likewise, apposition of non-pivot agents can also happen when an agent is plural. Plurality is marked with reduplication in Pangasinan. So in 5, we have a baseline PV clause, sinalu lalaki su aso, meaning the boys bought the dog. And likewise here, the agent is marked with the genitive case marker. When we have plural non-pivot agent apposition, instead of a singular pronoun, we see a genitive third-person plural clitic pronoun corresponding to the associate phrase. The associate phrase is also marked with ramai, which is a plural form of the demonstrative we saw in the previous slide. Besides non-pivots, apposition can also target pivots, which are in nominative case. In 7, we have AB clause, and here we see that the agent is marked with nominative case. In 8, when we have pivot apposition, instead of the genitive clitic pronoun, this thing is a bit, sorry. So in 8 here, instead of the genitive clitic pronoun, we get a nominative third plural clitic pronoun appearing directly after the verb. Likewise, we get a plural demonstrative marking the associate phrase. Here we note two quirks of the pivot apposition. The first quirk is that the third person plural clitic pronoun ra in the previous slide is actually optional for plural pivot apposition. Whereas when we talked about to and da, which are both genitive pronouns, they are obligatory. The second quirk is that Pangasinan actually does not have any nominative third person singular clitic pronoun, and hence, when there's third person singular pivot apposition, there is no pronoun. So in 9 here, we have Nampuniti lalaki may bile, where is the agent, the pivot, which is apposited, and it receives the demonstrative marking. However, we do not see any pronoun appearing after the verb because there's no nominative third person singular clitic pronoun. Later in this talk, we'll argue that even when now, the nominative third plural and third singular clitic pronouns are actually present. Sorry. Yes, so the data in this next slide might be familiar if you attended my talk in the morning. So apposition can also target possessors, which are genitive. So in 10, this is what I previously called internal possession, where we see a possessor being marked with the genitive case marker. So we have the boy, lalaki, being marked with the genitive marker. In 11, when we have possessor apposition, or what I previously called external possession, we see that the possessor is marked with the demonstrative my, and there is an additional clitic pronoun appearing on the possessum DP. So far, all the examples we have seen have involved clitic pronouns. However, according to Erlewine and Levine, clitic pronoun forms are only available for pivots and non-pivot agent arguments, as well as possessors. If we want to apposit a non-pivot team, we will thus have to use a full pronoun. So in 12, we have an AV clause, and when we try to do apposition on a non-pivot team, we have to use a full pronoun, which in this case is satan, oblique distal demonstrative. Likewise, when we have an inanimate pivot, we have to use a full pronoun in order for apposition to occur. So in 13, we have a PV clause and a team argument, which is apposited. And in this case, we co-index it with distal demonstrative. In each of these examples, the associate feels just like a post-verbal argument. These associates can be clause medial without any obvious comma or parenthetical intonation. If you notice in the previous slide, there was a pause between the pronoun and the demonstrative phrase, and this is because the pause might be in place to avoid having two adjacent demonstratives. Before moving on, we make a note here that the associate phrase do not actually have to remain in situ. They can undergo A-bar movement to appear pre-verbally. In 14, we have apposition of the non-pivot agent, and it can move from the gap that occurs post-verbally to pre-verbal for focused interpretation. So 14 means something literally like the boy, he read the book. Examples that are structurally similar to 14 have been attested in related Philippine languages, such as Tagalog, Bicol, and Kapampangan, and it has previously been described as some sort of hanging topic left dislocation, but only with the associate in pre-verbal topic position. I'll now hand over to Mitchell to talk about some possible analyses.
Metro, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Joey. So there are two families of possible analyses we might consider for a structure like this, which we'll walk through. The first is a clitic doubling type account. And this would be one where the associate, what we describe as the associate, is in some kind of normal argument position, so so-called true clitic doubling in Harazanov's terms. And then the associate DP is agreed with or partially copied, resulting in the appearance of the pronoun, which is often a clitic pronoun. In addition, for our examples, though, this process then has to have the effect of somehow blocking the associate DP from occurring with the expected case markers, such as nominative or genitive, because as we've seen, the associate DPs have to be introduced by one of these demonstratives. The alternative type of account we might think of is something that looks like a hanging topic account, where the associate gets base generated in some higher position, then C-commanding and binding the pronoun, which is in the conventional argument position. As I said, this predicts that the pronoun is actually in the normal argument position. What this might look like, relating it to cross-linguistic hanging topic constructions, would be something like the Greek hanging topic left dislocation here. And as has been described for these types of constructions cross-linguistically, this approach, because it's generated separately, predicts no case connectivity, right? So here in the Greek, we see the Maria and then accusative pronoun bound by it. For this type of derivation, the hanging topic has to somehow be exempt from regular case licensing and then be limited to some default case or topic marking. Here, we're going to argue in favor of that latter type of account, a kind of hanging topic account, with evidence from reflexive binding in the language. So as a baseline first, reflexive binding in Pangasinan behaves similarly to what's been described and is very familiar from Tagalog and Cebuano, which basically has two kinds of conditions. So one is that the antecedent in its theta position must C-command the reflexive. And second of all, the antecedent must linearly precede the reflexive. We'll quickly demonstrate this. So starting here with these PV transitive clauses. So we can have the genitive agent binding a nominative theme reflexive. That's possible, but the opposite configuration in 16b is not possible, regardless of the word order. And then condition 2 is the linear precedence constraint, that genitive agent binding the nominative reflexive is possible in 17a with that precedence order if we scramble them, which otherwise generally is possible post-verbally. Here with the reflexive, then that becomes ungrammatical. So with these two conditions on reflexive binding in mind, now let's take a look at the effect of apposition. So when apposition applies to the non-pivot agent of a PV clause, we see that descriptively the word order restriction between the actual pronounced associate nominal and the reflexive disappears. So the structure in 18a is maybe unsurprising. We can have the associate boy preceding the reflexive, but we can also scramble them as in 18b, and that's totally fine. And this contrasts from the examples that we had above. So the apparent insensitivity of reflexive binding to scrambling here with respect to the position of the agent associate is unexplained if the associate itself is the antecedent nominal, which then gets agreed with and then gets transformed into a demonstrative, something like that, under a clitic doubling type account. But it is instead explained if actually it's the clitic pronoun itself, which always appeared to the left in these cases, is the actual nominal that is active in this process of reflexive binding. That explains the fact that, as we saw, scrambling of the associate is actually irrelevant for the conditions on reflexive binding, because the so-called associate is actually not what is at play here. Likewise, when apposition applies to a pivot, the word order restriction again disappears. So we show this with a third plural pivot noun. So the children, we have the unsurprising order in 20a, that's grammatical, but then interestingly, the asymmetry disappears with 20b. We can scramble freely here again. And again, this can be explained with the clitic pronoun actually being ira here on the noun, actually being the nominal that is relevant for the process of reflexive binding. Remember too that the third plural nominative pronoun is optional with pivot apposition. Interestingly, if we take these examples and we take away that plural pronoun, still the facts are the same. So the scrambling is possible, that word order restriction disappears. So this supports our view that we can explain this full set of facts if pivot apposition with and without an overt pronoun are actually underlyingly structurally equivalent. And so the nominative third plural clitic pronoun simply has a null variant, and the third singular nominative pronoun is just inherently null. And so we'll use those assumptions here. Now I'd like to move on to our formal proposal. So for our proposal, we'll be building on widely adopted little VP phase-based accounts of Philippine type voice systems, which we've seen some many times in the past few days. The key idea is that the pivot is the highest DP in the little VP phase. The pivot receives nominative, and non-pivots generally receive genitive or some kind of oblique. Now, based on previous work of mine with some others and Megan Fowley's work, we assume that everything within this particular domain, the lower phase, gets linearized freely within there as long as the verbal complex is leftmost. And that's going to be one particular implementation for the descriptive observation that post-verbal word order seems to be free. Clitic pronouns also have a separate process by which they get linearized in their second position with the second position requirement. And now what we want to propose is that so-called apposition in Pangasinan resembles hanging topic left dislocation in other languages, but unlike other hanging topic left dislocations, we have to propose that it's a particular kind. So specifically, we want to claim that it is a low and integrated dislocation. Integrated in the sense that the associate is adjoined within the clause in a clause medial position, rather than something that's somehow later interpolated like a parenthetical. And then it's also low in the sense that the point of adjunction has to be in this clause medial little VP phase edge position that will then allow it to get linearized post-verbally rather than something in a canonical CP domain topic position higher up, as is more common cross-linguistically for hanging topic left dislocation type structures. So just to demonstrate this, we'll talk about the derivation for one of these first examples that we saw for non-pivot agent apposition. This can be derived in 3 steps. So illustrating quickly, we build the little VP phase edge for a PV clause. So the pivot theme will move to the outer specifier. This step and the next step actually could happen in a different order. But as expected, the pivot will get nominative case, the non-pivot agent will get genitive case. And then above that pronoun, which is the non-pivot agent, we can late adjoin, late merge the associate phrase, which has to be this demonstrative man in this example. As I just said, that could actually happen before we move the pivot above it, either way. And following Joey's talk from the previous block, this associate is adjoined as low as possible while binding the pronoun in its scope. Now that base generated associate has to be exempt from regular case licensing and case marking requirements, and therefore has to appear in a case invariant form as it's this hanging topic structure. And then because this happens in this relatively low position within the clause inside the little VP, it's within the domain that gets linearized in this special way where that entire structure allows for all different word orders as long as the verbal complex is leftmost. And that gives us the fact that this associate can get linearized post-verbally, just like any other argument without any sort of comma intonation or something like that. So although we claim that associates are some kind of hanging topic, essentially, and semantically just bind a pronoun in its scope, the associate has to be introduced in the local little VP edge just above the pronoun. And that evidence there was parallel evidence in Joey's talk earlier as well, but it comes from the fact that when you A-bar move these associates, it is island sensitive. So it can't simply be that you're allowed to base generate this hanging topic anywhere higher up in a position that can bind the pronoun. It has to actually be, again, integrated low into the clause, right above where the pronoun is introduced, and then can A-bar move from that position. And that's something familiar from the literature on left dislocation. So just to conclude, today we described this phenomenon of so-called argument apposition in Pangasinan, where a pronoun is accompanied by a corresponding case invariant associate DP. These associates are linearized and prosodified like any other postverbal argument without obvious comma or parenthetical interpretation, intonation. And we argue then that apposition reflects a process of some kind of hanging topic dislocation, but where that associate is adjoined low in the clause. And that gives us the sort of interesting characteristics of this structure. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. We have around 9 minutes for questions. Please raise your hand or say something in the chat. Yes, yeah.
I can go?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting and great data. I just have a question, and maybe I missed something, so this question might be off track. Could you get more than one of these? Because it seems if you can just adjoin them and are there any constraints on the associate itself? Like you say it has to bind a pronoun, but is that a property of the associate? And so how?
Yes, so you asked a great question, great in the sense that we have slides prepared for it. So basically So yes, you can do this multiply. I mean, Joey can speak to this much better than I can. Here, for example, is one example, a simple example where this applies both to the pivot and non-pivot agent in a PV clause simultaneously. And then something interesting, maybe not terribly surprising, happens where depending on how formally identical those two phrases then are, you get a word order restriction in terms of the kind of interpretations that you can get. And we can speak to that more if you're interested. But so yes, definitely you can get two. Joey also has, when combining, multiple argument apposition and also doing possessor apposition, like her external possession structures too, she has examples where you have like 3 or 4 my-marked phrases in a clause that seem totally interpretable, right, Joey? So, so that is possible. Yes, but each one has to bind a pronoun. The only exception is for pivot apposition where the pronoun is null. But so you can really literally go through and count these, and the my-marked phrases, these demonstrative phrases, and the pronouns that are in there really have to match up, or so it seems. Joey, I hope that was correct.
All right, next up we have Sandy.
Thanks, Joey and Mitchell. That was a very interesting talk. I have 2 related questions. First, I would like to know whether these hanging topics can occur in the full range of embedded clauses, including adjunct clauses. And second, I wonder if you have thought about their interpretation, specifically whose perspective they represent. So if they can be epithet-like entities, do they always represent the perspective of the speaker, or can it represent the perspective of a higher subject if they can be embedded? I'm thinking about Chris Potts's work, where he talks about how appositives, wherever they occur, they're sort of on a different dimension semantically. They always reflect the perspective of the highest attitude holder. Might be interesting to investigate that.
I think, let me try to, I think I can quickly just sort of say something about both of those, Sandy. So on the first point, I think we simply have not looked carefully across different kinds of clausal environments, and that's something that we would like to do, that we should do, especially because given this claim about sort of what kind of structure is necessary for where this happens, right? We might expect actually based on the proposal we gave that this might be very productive even in very reduced embedded contexts, which we should check, but we don't know. For the second point, so we may need to look at this a little bit more carefully, but my quick hunch or my understanding of the phenomenon is that this is not something that then is in some kind of conventional implicature, kind of other Pottsian dimension. It's really not in a positive in that sense. It really is just the identification of this pronoun, this argument with this description actually really is part of the truth conditional meaning when it's embedded, for example. And so again, we're using this apposition term maybe dangerously, just following Benton to describe this construction, but we're not claiming or really imagining that it descriptively has anything to do with, that kind of nominal positive structure, if that makes sense.
But it might. I mean, it would be worth
it
looking
may.
at. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, next up we have Matthew.
Hi there, thanks for the talk. I just have a question about case licensing and the idea of topics not needing to be given case. So I get the point. There's a lot of languages where you see hanging topics and they get default case, including accusative in English. But I'm just wondering how this fits together with the view that, I mean, you haven't said this explicitly, but perhaps I can assume that you're adopting, which is that the view that genitive on external arguments is a last resort fix for them not getting case. And that's what you're assuming. I'm just wondering, like, how do these two things fit together? The fact that on the one hand, topics can just be happy to not get case at all, but on the other, the external arguments, if they don't get case, they have to be like given case by some last resort mechanism.
Let me try to quickly address that. So yeah, thank you. So in Matthew, I think you've looked at some of my recent joint work, right? So about the default case for genitive and nominative, and a way that we might think about this is that, first of all, that these processes are separable, right? So this is really stuff that was motivated, I think, especially in my paper with another student on Bicol, where default case lower in the clause is genitive and default case above it is nominative, and basically things that actually are structurally different. They're higher hanging topics, but hanging topics in Bicol just appear not with a demonstrative, but just with the thing that really clearly looks like nominative case, and you can get these things multiply higher. That seems to be different in Pangasinan, right? It's different here in two ways. One is that whatever this hanging topic thing is, these associates seem to be lower in the clause and therefore get linearized very differently, but also they're different in not getting just some, default nominative, say, right? So I think what we probably want to say is that the mechanisms for sort of this kind of default licensing and also morphological case assignment is different in the language. And so it may be that in the higher domain, there is no free, everyone just generated there gets nominative for free kind of thing. And instead, the pivot is really the only thing that can get structural nominative. There is no default nominative in a higher domain of the clause, but if you get these extra things built, at least in these positions, then you have to sort of supply your own something demonstrative or some other phrase that allows you to live without any sort of morphological case distinction, right? So that must be a difference. I think that's compatible with things really lower in the little VP phase, including external arguments, then still getting some kind of genitive that might be a default genitive for actually theta role assigned arguments.
Very cool. Thanks.
Great. So we're out of time for questions, but we're going to have a 15-minute break now. So feel free to stick around and continue